Hi everyone, this is Caitlin Barlow, and for my final Tableau project, I decided to pose the research question: does the number of policies and incentives created by state legislatures motivate a large-scale transition to renewable energy sources? In other words, do states that have the most renewable energy and efficiency incentives also utilize renewable energy sources the most in comparison to other sources? The types of energy that the U.S. Energy Information Administration considers renewables are wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, and others. Just a quick look at the websites I use to get the data. Here is the DSIRE website, or also known as the Database of State Incentives for Renewable Efficiency. You can hover over a state and it'll tell you exactly how many policies and incentives that there are in that state. If you click on it, it'll break it down and give you more detailed lists, tell you whether it's a policy, incentive, or program. I just use this information to transition it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then I did the same with the EIA website, where you can click on a state and it brings up the end use energy consumption from 2018 in 3 different categories, about fuel source, consumption, and end use consumption by sector. So I did the same thing with this. I transitioned all 3 of these categories into an Excel database, and for time purposes, I've already put them in or connected it to Tableau. So we are going to go ahead and start with sheet 1. I'm going to call this DSIRE, data incentives, and we are going to go ahead and use the desire or DSIRE data on this sheet. We are going to drag over state, number of policies and incentives, use this show me menu to change to a packed bubble chart, drag state to colors, and numbers and policies to label. And as you can see, this pops up in a beautiful little visualization that shows these larger circles that have bigger numbers in them. Those are indicative of states that have a greater number of incentives, policies, and programs that are supposed to entice individuals, businesses, energy companies to transition to renewable energy sources. Keep this in mind for our next sheet, our next visualization. California, Minnesota, Washington, Oregon, Texas, Colorado, and New York are pretty much the major players in this. They definitely have the most. Okay, for sheet number 2, we are going to actually start comparing the data now and do a little bit more analysis. We are going to rename this to renewable energy to incentives comparison. Now for this, we are going to start with the end use by consumption table. We are going to drag state to columns, value to rows, and then we are going to move energy source to filter, where because we are talking about renewables, we are going to filter to just have renewables. Then we are going to pretty much copy those steps for the electric power sector consumption by energy source, state to columns, value to rows, and again filtering that energy source to just be renewables. Now we're going to bring the desired data in to compare, but the steps are very similar. You bring desire over to to columns, and then the number of policies and incentives are going to go in rows. And now we have 3 great graphs right here. We are going to bring in state to color, and that way it'll be much easier for us to read. When we go to this pane, we can choose entire view for our fit, and that way all of our information is visible. It's easier to read because of the colors and so on and so forth. If you look at this, you start to see a little bit of a difference compared to what I would have thought. Going into this, I assumed that the states that had the most incentives and programs for their states to transition to renewable energy sources. I thought the ones that had the most of those would also have used the most renewable energy sources, percentage wise comparing to other energy sources. So like we saw in our last graph, we have California, New York, Minnesota, Colorado, Washington, Oregon. Those are the largest spikes you see down here on the bottom. Now, when you look above at which states are actually using the most renewable energy sources by comparison, they don't necessarily match up. You see Iowa, Nebraska, Maine, South Dakota, and Vermont are all pretty much using the most renewable energy sources comparison-wise, and none of those were what we actually mentioned in, the previous sheet. Now, Washington and Oregon are close. They are definitely the closest ones to being, to seeing that there could be a relationship. Washington and Oregon use a greater percentage of renewables than a majority of the country, and they did have an elevated level of incentives and programs, however, not the most. So just interesting and something to keep in mind. We're going to move on to our next sheet, which shows this a little bit better and kind of expands on it a bit. We're going to rename it Renewables to Policy Comparison Map. All right, then we are going to drag in state from DSIRE, and that's going to auto-populate a map. Now we're going to create a calculated field. We're going to call this values, renewable values total. All right, then we are going to do value plus value for electric, and now this will give us those percentages again for the renewables. We're going to filter it for just the renewables, but it's going to give us a total view of renewables instead of it being separate. And we are going to move those onto our map and move them to our color. Change this to map. Now we need to filter. We are going to do renewables again. And then we're also going to use the number to label from the desired data. And we're actually going to exclude Alaska and Hawaii just because it'll be easier to see and they're kind of middle of the road. So like we saw in the last chart, some of these lighter colored things or states that are supposed to have the most numbers and policies that you would think would have the greatest amount of renewable usage actually do not. Maine has the most renewable source usage by percentage, and they only have 20 incentives and programs. And I feel like it's worth noting that not all policies and programs are created equally. I do know that, however, you would think that the states that put in the time and the effort to create these policies and incentives would also, have the most renewable energy source usage. However, that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. Now for this new dashboard, I just created a new dashboard instead of a new sheet. I transitioned this to floating. And now I am just kind of cleaning it up, bringing in our desired data incentives, our renewables, to policy comparisons. And now you have everything kind of in this easy to read, easy to use little space on this dashboard. I actually learned a lot doing this. I didn't think that it would be quite as easy as it was to make this all look this way in the end. But as you can see, the states that have the most incentives and programs don't necessarily have the most renewable energy usage. So I thought that was interesting to find out, and thank you for watching.